So a few months ago, I posted a video in which I somewhat concluded that the carnivore diet appears to be a fairly effective approach at optimizing testosterone production. However, with the carnivore diet gaining more and more mainstream attention, I thought it would also be a good idea to take a more balanced look and approach at some of the possible downsides of the carnivore diet as well. Now, the first and most notable downside to the carnivore diet appears to be a reduction in athletic performance. Now, in the carnivore and ketogenic communities, there is a large emphasis on the body's ability to adapt to using fat as an energy substrate. And according to the literature, this does appear to be a very measurable phenomenon that does in fact occur when switching from a carbohydrate-based diet to a fat-based diet. And because of this adaptation to utilizing fats for energy as opposed to glucose, there does appear to be a somewhat sparing effect on muscle glycogen levels, which is the stored glucose in muscle tissue. However, the issue here is that alongside the adaptation to utilizing fat and increasing the body's ability to use fat for energy, there also appears to be a downregulation in the metabolic processes that utilize glucose to produce ATP. And the reason this is not necessarily a good thing is that when you get into the maximal range of work output of around 70 to 90% of your VO2 max, these types of activities actually require glucose as an energy substrate. And so if there is a down regulation in the efficiency of the metabolic pathways that use glucose to produce ATP, there does in fact appear to be a reduction in physical performance, specifically in this 70 to 90% of your VO2 max. Now, to be clear, there does not appear to be a reduction in performance when it comes to endurance activity or even types of activity like powerlifting that heavily rely on fats and creatine phosphate as an energy substrate. However, when you are engaging in activities that require glucose, such as hypertrophic activity, or even things like sprinting or anything that gets you into your 70 to 90% of your VO2 max for extended periods of time, there does appear to be somewhat of a reduction in performance. Now, this is not to say that a low carbohydrate, ketogenic, or even carnivore style of diet doesn't have its place when it comes to athletic capacity and specifically in regards to increasing the body's ability to use fat as an energy substrate for particular time periods. However, if you are someone who is engaging in regular activity that requires glucose as an energy substrate, it may be beneficial to somewhat add carbohydrates back into your diet on top of a carnivore style of diet in a proportion to your activity level, just to ensure that you aren't experiencing any reductions in performance. Now, with that being said, if you are committed to a low or zero carbohydrate style of carnivore diet, it is thought that adding some extra electrolytes into your diet can help to offset some of the downsides to athletic performance that a low carbohydrate diet can cause, which is why today's video is actually sponsored by Element. Now, Element is a perfectly proportioned electrolyte mix of sodium, potassium, and magnesium that makes it extremely easy to help meet your electrolyte needs in order to stay optimally hydrated, especially while on a low carbohydrate diet. Drinking Element lately during my workouts, especially during the periods of low or even zero carbohydrate consumption, has absolutely been a game changer for me personally. And so if you're anything like me trying to optimize and maintain optimal physical and mental performance under somewhat extreme dietary conditions, I can't more highly recommend Element. And what's more is that right now they're offering you guys a free sample pack of an 8 serving of Element for free with any order, but this deal is only available through the link that's in the description of this video. So make sure to follow the link down below or go to drinkelement.com/nutrition library to snag this offer. Now, the second possible downside when it comes to a carnivore style of diet kind of goes along with our first point, and that is a reduction in the ability to build muscle mass. Now, the first possible reason for this is somewhat obvious. If a low carbohydrate style of diet does in fact reduce the body's ability and down regulates the glucose dependent metabolic pathways that fuel hypertrophic training, you would obviously expect to see a reduction in the amount of muscle mass that is built secondarily to the reductions in performance that are specifically in the range that are required to stimulate muscle growth. Now, it is worth noting that there are 3 metabolic pathways that are thought to lead to muscle hypertrophy. One of those is fueled by fat, one of those is fueled by glucose, and the other is fueled by creatine. However, it is believed that the metabolic pathway that is fueled by glucose is the most potent in regards to stimulating muscle growth, and so again, if there is in fact a reduction in the abilities of the cells to produce ATP via glucose, you would expect to see a reduction as well in the ability to build muscle mass as well. Now, another possible reason that the carnivore diet may reduce the ability of your body to put on muscle mass is because the carnivore diet encourages a reduction in caloric intake. Many individuals find it fairly difficult to maintain the caloric intake that's required to maintain body mass while on a carnivore diet, much less consume enough calories to increase their lean body mass while on this type of diet. And so if you are specifically trying to increase your lean body mass, this may be of practical concern to you in particular. Now, another possible reason as to why the carnivore style of diet may decrease the body's ability to increase muscle mass while on a carnivore diet is that the carnivore diet does appear to decrease the inflammatory response to exercise. And because the inflammatory response is so integral to the anabolic response to exercise, it may secondarily to reducing the inflammatory response, reduce the body's ability to recover and compensate for that athletic activity. And then the last possible reason that a low carbohydrate or carnivore style of diet may decrease the body's ability to increase muscle mass, according to recent research, is by increasing the oxidation of dietary and endogenous amino acids. Because amino acids can be used for the process of gluconeogenesis or the process of taking non-glucose substrates and turning them into glucose, there may be an increase in the body's need for protein. And so if you are going to choose to stay on a low or zero carb style of carnivore diet, you may need to increase your protein requirements in order to meet the demand of gluconeogenesis in order to kind of build that foundation so that your body has enough amino acids available to then build new tissue. Now, there is a strong argument to be made that simply increasing your caloric, protein, and fat intake while on a zero carb carnivore diet can help to offset many of these downsides that can lead to lowered anabolic activity. However, one of the biggest factors that appears to lead to decreased anabolic activity is just simply a downregulation of the use of glucose for the purpose of sparing muscle glycogen. And so it's really, really hard, and it's really hasn't been seen yet if this can be actually overcome by possibly like a long-term zero carb diet. However, for those that are specifically trying to maximize physical performance and maximize anabolic activity, introducing some level of carbohydrate intake in proportion to your activity level may be beneficial in this regard. Now, the next possible downside of a carnivore diet is possible elevations in cortisol and stress markers. Now, it has long been thought that one of the primary downsides, hormonally speaking, when it comes to a zero carb or carnivore diet is an elevation in cortisol levels. And to be fair, this does appear to actually persist for about 3 weeks while transitioning from a high carb to low carb style of diet. However, after that 3 weeks and after that adaptation period appears to happen, there does appear to be a drop of cortisol and other stress hormones back down to baseline. However, it is yet to be seen whether or not those that are engaged in regular glucose-dependent activity may actually experience an extension of this period. If you are engaging in activity that is demanding glucose and you are not consuming consuming any glucose, it is possible that there may be an extended period of time whereby you do actually experience elevations in cortisol and elevations of other stress hormones. And to some degree, there is some evidence to suggest that this might be the case, simply because when you look at individuals that are engaging in activity, even several months after going onto a low carbohydrate diet, they do appear to not experience a baseline increase of cortisol, but do appear to experience an increase in cortisol levels when compared to controls during specifically their activities. Now, for most people that are transitioning from a standard diet to a carnivore diet, this may not be of practical concern. However, for individuals that are engaging in regular glucose-dependent activity, maybe guys that are maybe elite level athletes or bodybuilders or something of that nature, this may be a practical concern and reason to somewhat add some carbohydrates back into your diet in order to keep stress hormones lower. Now, the next downside is actually a possible increase in SHBG levels, or sex hormone binding globulin. Now, this is something that I dive super deep into in my latest video on sex hormone binding globulin, but there may be a insulin-dependent pathway whereby a low-carbohydrate diet might induce elevations in sex hormone binding globulin. Because insulin appears to suppress SHBG when you reduce your carbohydrate intake, there is a reduction in insulin levels that does appear to allow for a rise in sex hormone binding globulin. Now, for the general public that isn't engaged in frequent glucose-dependent activity, this may not be of practical concern. However, for guys that are working out several times a week in that maximal range of activity, you may be placing your body into a position where it needs more protein and more fat and more calories, and places a higher demand on glucose because of that. And this is one of the possible reasons why you may be seeing an elevation in sex hormone binding globulin. So again, for the general population, this is probably not of practical concern, but for guys that are highly active, you may either want to be extremely mindful of your caloric, protein, and fat intake, or two, to just simply add in your diet some carbohydrate intake in order to meet that glucose demand and reduce the demand that your body is placing on protein and fats to produce glucose. Now, the last possible downside that I want to talk about before we get into some of the upsides of the carnivore diet, and specifically a zero-carb carnivore diet, is possible reductions in thyroid hormones. Now, this has long been postulated in the ketogenic communities and likely has some relevance for the carnivore community, and that is because largely thyroid hormones do appear to decrease or can possibly decrease when glucose intake is reduced, and that's because thyroid hormones, one of their primary purposes is to metabolize and increase the metabolic pathways that metabolize glucose. And so when you reduce your glucose intake, it is thought that there could be a reduction in thyroid hormones. However, for me personally, this is a non-issue, largely because I believe that you can offset this by simply increasing your iodine intake, increasing your seafood intake, as well as possibly even supplementing with a desiccated thyroid hormone or thyroid gland specifically. Now, with all of that being said, it is my general thesis for the general population, a low carbohydrate or even zero carbohydrate carnivore style of diet can be a great way to improve overall health and well-being, as well as hormonal status. However, for those of you that are engaged in regular physical activity that is glucose dependent, adding in carbohydrate sources might be a good way to maintain performance, maintain muscle mass, as well as maintain hormonal status. But with all the downsides of the carnivore diet out of the way, I do think it would be unfair to not talk about some of the upsides of specifically a zero carbohydrate carnivore diet. And the first one is the avoidance of food sensitivities. Now, this is actually one of the most important upsides of the carnivore diet, and that is largely because food sensitivities have been known to trigger autoimmune diseases as well as inflammatory conditions in specific people that are susceptible to them. And so by going on a carnivore diet, you can largely avoid a lot of these food sensitivities, which are too many to list in this video, but I'll kind of try to throw them up on the screen here. And the big thing to note here is that a lot of these food sensitivities, these molecules that kind of cause some mayhem for specific individuals, cause mayhem on their immune system and trigger inflammatory conditions, a lot of these molecules are indeed found in carbohydrate sources as well as pretty much every other plant for that matter. And so if you are somebody specifically dealing with some type of autoimmune condition or inflammatory condition, going on a carnivore diet can be a fantastic way to help mitigate some of those conditions, possibly. However, for individuals that don't struggle with these types of conditions, adding in some low sensitivity types of carbohydrate sources for the purpose of improving physical performance and improving muscle building potential can also be a good idea. And these would be things like white rice and white potatoes. Even white bread in some individuals can be a good option, as well as honey and maple syrup and fruit. And so these are some of my personal favorites that tend to not cause people as many issues as some of the other carbohydrate sources, but it is largely going to depend on your personal genetics. For instance, I do fairly well with white bread and actually feel worse when I consume a lot of fruit, and so I try to balance some of these carbohydrate sources, particularly when I'm in instances of higher carbohydrate intake. Sometimes I'm in no carbohydrate intake. Sometimes I'm increasing my carbohydrate intake. And so finding those specific carb sources that are right for you is going to be a really good option for you if you're trying to optimize your performance through the consumption of carbohydrates. But again, if you're somebody who is dealing with one of these inflammatory conditions or autoimmune conditions, foregoing carbohydrate intake and just plant intake in general can be a great way to experience remission. Now, the second benefit of the carnivore diet that a lot of people talk about is the sustained energy levels. One, sustained energy levels after a meal. You don't feel like taking a nap every time you eat. And then also sustained energy levels between meals. And this is largely because, one, you're avoiding food sensitivities, and then two, because you're avoiding extremely high spikes in blood sugar, which kind of causes blood sugar insulin roller coaster that tends to disrupt consistent energy levels. Now, the next benefit of the carnivore diet that a lot of people tout is just simply ketosis. When you eliminate carbohydrates from your diet, your body will switch to fats as a substrate and produce more ketone bodies, which does appear to have a notable effect on cognition. So for individuals that are specifically looking to kind of gain a kind of an edge in their cognitive performance and their focus and their attention, going on a carnivore diet and getting into ketosis just in general appears to be a great way to gain this mental edge as well. Now, another possible benefit of the carnivore diet is just simply increasing your nutrient intake, because some of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet are meat or animal-based products, things like muscle meat, organ meat, as well as eggs and dairy and even fish. There is, generally speaking, an increase in the nutrient intake while you are on a carnivore diet, which is going to have a host of possible health benefits as well as performance benefits. Now, the last possible benefit of a carnivore diet, which is why a lot of individuals choose to go on a carnivore diet, is weight loss. However, I do think it's worth noting here that the only reason that the carnivore diet appears to be effective at inducing weight loss is simply because it's inducing a calorie deficit. It is particularly difficult to overconsume calories while on a carnivore diet, and it is particularly filling. Meat is very filling, and so it's really difficult to overeat while on a carnivore diet, and you're also eliminating some of the more more tastier foods in life. You can't have pizza, you can't have bread, you can't have any of these types of foods that tend to induce overeating. And so a lot of people do experience a lot of benefit and when it comes to weight loss by going on a carnivore diet. However, it's technically nothing special when compared to just a regular old caloric deficit. The main edge when it comes to weight loss is just simply that it's difficult to eat too much while on a carnivore diet. And so when it comes to the carnivore diet, I do think it is really circumstance dependent. If you're an individual that has a lot of inflammatory and autoimmune issues, going zero carb on the carnivore diet can be a great option for you. However, you don't struggle with these issues and are extremely active and are engaging in a lot of glucose dependent activity, increasing your carbohydrate intake in order to match your energy output and your glucose output might also be a great option. But in general, I'm a huge fan of the carnivore diet, and that's pretty much all I have for this video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. Make sure to snag your free sample pack of Element in the description box below. And other than that, I will see you guys next time.